Britain was once the preeminent global superpower as a pioneer of industrialisation that would reshape the future and a reach that spanned across the planet.
The sun never set on the British Empire, until it did.
So what the happened to my beloved Britain? Turn on any news station today and you'll see sights of looted shops, smashed up streets and hooligans clashing with riot police. But the recent riots in the Southport area, unfortunately, are nothing new. Civil unrest happened back in 81, 85 and 1990. 2001 and 2005 also saw tensions reach boiling point in Bradford and Birmingham. In 2010, angry students smashed up the Conservative Party headquarters after the government hiked up university fees. 1 year later, a police shooting triggered unrest across the entire capital. Every time riots break out, experts ask the same question. How much of this is caused by socio-economic policies and culture clashes, and how much is just opportunistic destruction fueled by far-right groups and left-wing agitators? The answer depends on who you ask. Economists will cite the UK's high inflation and stagnant wages as root causes. The UK may still be in the top 10 economies by GDP, but it won't be for much longer, and its most immediate issues have gone from controlling its global empire to managing its rampant poverty. Meanwhile, some social scientists point to public spending cuts and austerity. Others say mass immigration and an unaffordable national health service have strained infrastructure to breaking point. Then there are the artists and entertainers. Despite the British accent being popular amongst Hollywood productions, British influence isn't what it was since the days of Britpop and Beatlemania. Before Harry Potter was adapted into movies, the British film industry was on life support. As for football, the less said, the better. But what really rubs salt in the wound is how Britain's status stands in stark contrast to its former glory. The little island almost dominated the entire world through military might and naval power. Then it ruled through industry and commerce. During the 20th century, the underdog helped fend off global threats to become a political powerhouse. However, slowly but surely, that status has been diminishing. They say in life, everything moves slowly until it happens all at once. So, was the United Kingdom's decline really slow and steady, or did a few bad decisions suddenly shove the superpower to the brink of irrelevance? It's time to learn how history works as we track the 400-year rise and fall of Britain. Here's British history in a nutshell. After building Stonehenge for some reason, Britons were invaded by Romans, then Anglo-Saxons, and finally French Vikings, who took over in 1066. This triggered almost 1,000 years of fighting between England and France. However, that wasn't the last time Britain was invaded. In 1797, an Irish-American commander led revolutionary French forces to invade the quaint Welsh coastal town of Fishguard. But they stopped pillaging and surrendered when they saw British infantry lining the coast. Except it wasn't redcoats, it was women, whose traditional red shawls and tall black hats looked like soldiers from a distance. It was only once Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated during the Battle of Waterloo that the Brits and Frenchies decided to bury the hatchet once and for all. Not because the two nations got bored of fighting a neighbour who was only 21 miles away. The tide had been turning ever since the Age of Discovery. Technology had advanced so much between the 1400s and 1700s that discovering new trade routes became a top priority. Power shifted away from geographical dominance to economic strength. Things went into overdrive when the likes of Spain, England and France discovered the Americas. With two brand new continents prime for the taking, the European powers raced for first place. Whichever country controlled the new lands would surely control the world. France and Spain were well positioned to cross the Atlantic with a sizable landmass and population to supply resources and manpower. Great Britain was much smaller, yet strategically placed. A wide open shot across the Atlantic meant a shorter journey. It also provided a strong reconnaissance for competing vessels. Enemy ships would think twice about using the English Channel. But Britain's advantage would be lost without footing in the New World. So Britain began colonial ventures in earnest by settling in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. Colonies sprouted up across the eastern seaboard to become vital sources of sought-after raw materials, tobacco, sugar, and cotton. For sugar plantations, Britain also used its colonies in the Caribbean. What can we say? If you've been overthrown by Romans and Vikings, and even the French, you pick up a thing or two about invading. Then in 1588, the world saw the might of Her Majesty's nautical power when the British Navy defeated the Spanish Armada. This turning point in world history set Britain on the fast track to world dominance. King Philip II of Spain sent a fleet of 130 huge ships to overthrow the British monarchy, but Britain's navy of smaller vessels and merchant boats outmaneuvered their formidable opponents. This was the period's geopolitical equivalent of being the new guy in prison who knocks out the gang leader in a single punch. With military supremacy firmly established and the reputation to back it up, England doubled down on its imperialist project. In 1600, the British East India Company was granted a royal charter to establish British trade dominance in the East. With colonial projects picking up speed in all directions, the stage was set for merry old England to become the indisputable world leader in might, money, and influence. Sure, it lost its American colonies to, traitorous revolutionaries in 1776, but that wasn't the end of the world. If settlers really want to revolt over a small tea tax just so citizens could be taxed higher on state and local sales, federal estate, gasoline, tobacco, gift, tattoos, candy and pies, and have to declare their federal income tax forever, even if they don't live in the United States of America, well then, let them. Besides, Britain got to keep its land speculation and investments. We didn't even lose trade. So while America incurred debt for their independence, Britain wrote the whole thing off as a business expense. Anyway, the point is that despite some blips, things were going strong for the small island. Yet there were still great heights to climb before it came crashing down. The Industrial Revolution began in Britain, so add black lung and global warming to the list of British achievements. It started with advancements from the Agricultural Revolution. Things like selective breeding of livestock and crop rotation helped create food surplus to support the growing population. This freed up labour to move to more urban areas in search of industrial work. Then James Watt refined the steam engine in what was the 1760s version of unveiling the smartphone. The world was never the same after that. By 1764, the spinning jenny was invented, and in 1769, the water frame hit the scene. By 1784, when the power loom appeared, the entire textile industry had been revolutionised. Sure, a few little kids lost their limbs cleaning out their threshing machines, but you can't make an industrial revolution without breaking some legs. Mass production was in. Capitalism was here to stay. Factories were the hot new way to structure societies. Adopting industrialisation ahead of European rivals paid off literally. The industry was making more profit than colonial trade. Of course, it helped to have a vast trade network to export goods. No wonder Britain earned the name the workshop of the world. She was producing most of the world's coal, iron and textiles. All that money helped fortify the country's financial institutions. Throughout the 19th century, Britain was able to maintain its position as the world's leading economic power. In 1851, the Great Exposition was staged in London to showcase the nation's might. However, some scholars argue that Britain wasn't so great during the Industrial Revolution. According to Geoffrey G. Williamson, Britain's economic growth was slower than expected. He suggests the cost of wars with France hindered growth more than we'd like to admit. As the century closed, Germany and the United States of America emerged as industrial powers too. And they didn't have the head start or trade network of Britain. So how much of Britain's economic strength was an over-speculation? And was its military edge really that powerful? Well, economists were about to find out, because at the start of the 20th century, the world's empires decided to put everything on the line. Competition for colonies, fights over resources, and stockpiling of weapons meant superpowers were poised for a conflict. Multi-ethnic groups were seeking independence in the likes of the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, which meant discontent and uprising were in the air. Add to that a Europe divided over two prime alliances, Britain, France and Russia on one side, and Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy on the other, and any small conflict would cascade into a broader war. The powder keg had been set. All that was needed was a match. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Bosnian Serb nationalists in 1914 caused a chain reaction of events which culminated in Austria-Hungary declaring war on Serbia. To make a long story short, World War I sucked. Sure, it gave us Blackadder goes forth, but at the cost of 16 million lives. Though some resources estimate the death toll was between 15 and 20 million. And once the fighting was over, all the debt and borrowing Britain incurred to fund the campaign had shifted the country from the world's biggest lender to one of its biggest debtors. The total cost of the war for Britain was about $35 billion at the time. Adjusting for modern inflation, that's closer to $735 billion. And with a lower population of young men, many returning home with deep psychological issues, it's not hard to imagine how this impacted family life, employment, and the economy. World War II only compounded the damage. Although Britain emerged victorious once again, the national debt dwarfed that from World War I. At the end of 1945, the national debt was about $27 billion, which was about 270% of the country's GDP. Adjusting for modern inflation, that's just over $470 billion. Over the next 30 years, the debt rose to $64 billion in nominal terms. Parts of this had to do with having to rebuild the country. Infrastructure was decimated during the Blitz. But out of the rubble came a strong sense of camaraderie, which resulted in the creation of the National Health Service. However, maintaining such a project has not been easy, or cheap. Between 2022 and 2023, the NHS cost £181.7 billion, with almost 95% of that funding day-to-day items like medicine and staff salaries. To the Brits, its national healthcare system is more than a progressive medical policy. It's a symbol of the British fighting spirit. Unfortunately, rebuilding Britain was fraught with difficulty. Industries which had powered the nation for ages were now outdated. Yet, post-war Britain was slow to react. Coal mining, steel production, and textiles might have been moneymakers during the 19th century, but the 20th century was all about innovation. America and West Germany invested in modernising industries. Britain lost its competitive edge. Plus, the breakup of the British Empire radically reduced the government's finances, political influence, military presence, and cultural identity. When India and Pakistan became independent in 1947, it was the beginning of the end. Access to key resources and markets became harder. Britain was in a precarious position. Unfortunately, a series of policy missteps took things from bad to worse. Austerity and public cuts increased social unrest and led to turbulent economic times. Unemployment and inflation were common, especially during the 1970s. This peaked with the Winter of Discontent of 78 and 79, when strikes became widespread. There was a housing crisis, poor urban planning, and a decline in quality of life. Some of the homes built during the 60s were closer to homes of East Germany than European neighbours. And as the population grew, the NHS took on more strain despite cuts. In response, Britain encouraged immigration, with many migrants coming from former colonies to work in the NHS. Unfortunately, an increase in ethnic diversity also saw a rise in racist groups, like the skinheads of the National Fronts and the controversial British National Party. The 60s and 70s were marked by financial hardship, racial conflict and discontent. International relations became worse during the Cold War. Take the case of Roger Hollis. He was a British intelligence officer and director of MI5 from 1956 to 1965. He was also a Soviet spy. Britain was in such disarray that an agent of the USSR reached the second-in-command position of the country's entire intelligence network. However, it should be noted that technically Hollis was cleared of any wrongdoing. MI5's official website, Margaret Thatcher and the Soviets all said he was not a traitor. Whether that's true or some deep state 4D chess move doesn't matter. What matters is the fact that Britain's reputation as an international vanguard was evaporating rapidly. Look at the Falklands War, which technically wasn't a war, it was a conflict. To date, many Britons still take issue with Margaret Thatcher's decision to defend Britain's overseas territory when they were invaded by Argentina's authoritarian military junta. Following a coup d'etat in 1976, the junta ruled Argentina with an iron fist. They had a penchant for forced disappearances, torture, and dropping dissidents out of helicopters. The Falkland Islands are 300 miles from the southern coast of Argentina, so there has been a territorial dispute ever since Britain beat out France and Spain to establish control. So when the junta decided to take over in 1982, they deployed several landing ships, troops, and a naval fleet of destroyers, frigates, and corvettes, plus air support as backup. In response, Britain sent a larger, more comprehensive task force 8,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, composed of better trained, better equipped soldiers. 74 days later, Argentina surrendered. 18 months later, the humiliated military dictatorship was overthrown. Civilian rule returned. In a callback to the victory over the Spanish Armada, Britain's naval dominance had reinvigorated Britain's image, even if it was just in political circles. But with the 90s on the horizon, the admiration for Britain would return to the masses. Spice Girls, Oasis, Harry Potter. Cool Britannia was a cultural phenomenon. It might be hard to imagine in an era of K-pop and Taylor Swift, but Britain's cultural dominance in the lead up to the millennium made Beatlemania seem like a dead meme. Bands like Blur, Pulp, and The Prodigy dominated music charts across the world. Films like Trainspotting and 4 Weddings and a Funeral made British actors a hot commodity in Hollywood. Then there was the fashion. Designers like Alexander McQueen and Vivienne Westwood, and models like Kate Moss and Naomi Campbell were a mainstay at fashion shows. Even Mr. Bean was big. In the same way that Britain successfully pivoted from trade routes to industry, it looked like Britain had once again found the next big thing. When Tony Blair's youthful and modern New Labour movement won by a landslide during the 1997 general elections, the return of Britain's patriotism and triumphalism had been cemented. Despite some economic upsets at the start of the decade, most of the 90s was a booming economy for the Brits. London had become a cultural and financial global centre. A shift towards high-tech sectors helped restructure the loss of industries ever since Thatcher closed down the mines. Plus, an influx of overseas investment boosted the economy even more. Globalisation was poised to become the next big thing, with Britain as a key figure. But that was almost a quarter of a century ago. And unfortunately, those prosperous times planted seeds for Britain's next season of misfortune. Britain's relationship with the EU has always been at arm's length. Despite being an early member, it's not part of the continent and never joined the single currency. Culturally, it's caught between European sensibilities and American society. Add to that the close ties and language with the biggest global superpower, and you can imagine why Britain had such a standoffish relationship with the European Union. Whatever you might think of the media coverage of Brexit, EU membership was a bipartisan issue for most of British history. Left-wingers like Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn had been vocal critics throughout their careers, and Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron backed the Remain campaign. In fact, most Tory MPs were against Brexit when the referendum was initially announced. Even Marxist journalist Christopher Hitchens had doubts over the euro currency. His right-wing brother, Peter Hitchens, has been criticising the EU's overreach for years, although there was a point in the 90s when he admitted a loss of sovereignty was worth future stability. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, discontent for the single market grew. As the consumerism of the 90s gave way to gentrification and unemployment, the free movement of foreign nationals exacerbated employment tensions within industry. This was felt hardest in the north because these former cities of industry had received less funding and support over the decades. Scotland's push for independence also threatened the unity of the British Isles. The SNP held a referendum on Scottish independence in 1997 and lost. So they did another once-in-a-lifetime vote in 2014 and lost again. But when Brexit unexpectedly won its referendum through a narrow victory in 2016, the SNP demanded a do-over. The third time might be the charm. They argued that most of Scotland had voted to remain in the EU, so that had the independence vote occurred after Brexit, then Scotland would have been independent of Britain, so that it could be dependent on Europe? Apparently, the SNP understands democracy as little as it understands sovereignty. The big question now is whether or not leaving the European Union has put Britain on a course correction. Peter Hitchens says the botched trade deals meant Britain freeing itself of Brussels only to be pushed around by China has ruined the chances of a fresh start. Depending on who you ask, Brexit's impact on the UK's economy is either setting the country up for an irreversible downfall or a small price to pay for a prosperous future. After all, their biggest allies are some of the world's richest countries. If Trump is re-elected, Britain's best friend would be a billionaire. But would Donald help the UK get a better trade deal, or just put himself out in front? Then again, maybe it's not a coincidence that Britain has strong ties with rich nations. Most of the biggest GDPs are former colonies and enemies. America, Germany, Japan, India, France, Canada. Maybe Britain doesn't need to pull itself up by its bootstraps if the rest of the world has its back. Maybe all the Brits have to do to make Great Britain great again is to develop ties with China and Brazil. Maybe Britain's legacy isn't enough to get through another rough patch. Or maybe Britain can't keep bringing up the fact that it built the world. Maybe that card has been played too many times. Maybe it's time to retire gracefully and go quietly into the night. Is Britain overdue for a resurgence, or is the naysaying just haters with a skill issue? If you liked this video, be sure to check out our one on the British East India Trading Company. And subscribe to keep learning how history works.